welcome or welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name's Emma. I did just want to take a minute before we get into the video to thank all of you guys. I have been getting so much love and support from you, especially on my recent videos, and the growth I've seen on my channel and my videos makes me so happy. I've always been a lover of social media and have spent the last 4 years really growing my platform on TikTok, but I've been passionate about YouTube for longer. When I was really little, I used to film YouTube videos on my iPad, but then they would never get posted. But I would straight up be sitting in my bedroom doing get to know me tags, doing monthly favorite videos, and it was literally just for my own enjoyment because I absolutely love and have always loved content creation. And now that I'm getting to actually share that with you all and receiving positive feedback from you guys, I mean, genuinely, you don't know how much it means to me. But on that note, there are so many of you guys that are new to this page lately, and maybe you don't know me from TikTok already and you found me on YouTube. So I really want to do like a get to know me Q&A style video so I can chat with you guys and you guys can get to know me a little bit better. But the only problem is I don't know what questions to answer. I feel like people don't really do get to know me tags anymore. So if you're watching this and there's any specific questions you would want me to answer in that type of video, comment them below and I'll be sure to answer them when I do film my get to know me video. And now let's get into what we're actually here for, which is all of my fall book recommendations. I recently filmed my fall TBR list, so if you do want to check that out, I'll link it up here somewhere if you want to see the books that are on my radar currently for fall. But these are going to be all of the books I've already read that I would recommend to you guys for the fall time. I'm going to use the same categories I used in my TBR video, which are fantasy, romance, mystery thriller, and other, which is just like other random genres that don't fit those categories. But without further ado, let's start with fantasy. The first recommendation I have is the Powerless Trilogy by Lauren Roberts. This is a YA fantasy romance series that follows Peyton and Kai. Basically, in this world, there are ordinaries and then there are elites, and the elites have powers and the ordinaries don't. And in this society, the king believes that the ordinaries should be shunned and banished, but every so many years there is like a big contest, like trial type of situation, a little bit reminiscent of the Hunger Games, that is held for the elites to compete. And our main character Peyton is an ordinary who's posing as an elite and living amongst them. She, in a chance encounter, saves the prince's life and then gets called to the castle to participate in these games. It's enemies to lovers, it's great tension and banter. I could go on and on about all the phenomenal tropes, but something about the world and the setting is just so fall to me. I also think these are really great starter books if you're new to the fantasy genre because the world building and politics aren't that complicated. It's mainly focusing on the romance, but it's just in a fantasy setting. My next recommendation is another YA fantasy. A lot of people would classify it as romance, but in my opinion, it's very minimal romance, and that is The Cruel Prince or the Folk of Air series. There's your main trilogy, which is The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing, and then you also have spin-off books, Stolen Heir, and what's the other one called? Prisoner's Throne. The reason that I'm recommending this for the fall time is because this fantasy world is so whimsical and magical and just fun to be in. Something about Holly Black's writing just sucks you straight into the story, and it is escapism at its finest. The action, the mystery, the political intrigue, it's all just so fun. And I think one time I made a TikTok where I said that The Cruel Prince was a fun, whimsical, magical story, and someone in the comments was like, what are you talking about? They're literally unaliving each other in this book. And it is very, very high stakes, but still the magic system and this world that Holly Black has created is just fun to be in. In a way, it kind of gives like fairy tale-esque vibes if it was a lot more cutthroat and intense. The basis of the story is that there is a human who is stolen away from the human realms and forced to grow up in the fairy realms. Her name is Jude, and in this world, the fae are very cunning and a little bit cruel, and it kind of just follows her trying to navigate living in this world as a human. I'm not gonna explain too much more about it because I think you just need to go into it, but I just love that series so much, and I think a whimsical fantasy is always perfect in the fall time. My next recommendation is another YA fantasy romance, and that is the These Hollow Vows duology. Similarly to The Cruel Prince, this is a very whimsical fairy tale-esque world, but this one is definitely a little bit heavier on the romance than the fantasy. I flew through both of these books. There's a little love triangle situation going on. It's enemies to lovers. I would almost describe it kind of like if you mixed ACOTAR with The Cruel Prince. It's obviously YA, so like that aspect of ACOTAR is not involved, but kind of just the setup of the Fae world is a little reminiscent of ACOTAR. And this one also follows a human who is taken into the fairy world, but she's going to try and save her sister, who she believes has been kidnapped by an evil king. And she finds herself being selected for kind of a competition to become the princess. The Fae prince basically houses all of these women in the castle, and then they get eliminated as the weeks go by. It's kind of like The Selection and like The Bachelor, but make it fantasy. But then there's all these other side elements going on. I'm doing a really bad job at explaining what this is about. I would say the Bachelor/Bachelorette competition element isn't the main focus. It's kind of just like the setting she gets thrown into, and then all this other stuff happens. But I could not recommend that series more, and I think it does not get enough hype on the internet. I feel like people are constantly talking about their favorite enemies to lovers fantasies, and I never see this one brought up, and it's phenomenal. And once again, I just feel like the whimsical kind of fairy tale feeling fantasies just fit the fall season perfectly. My next recommendation is the Serpent and Dove trilogy. This is a YA fantasy romance, and it's witch versus witch hunter. A witchy fantasy in the fall time is the best thing that could ever happen. This takes place in a fantasy world, but the world very much resembles France and French culture, which I thought was a really interesting touch. It's basically about a witch who is living in disguise, and then the male main character, it's hard to explain because he's kind of like a guard or like the police. Like, he is a witch hunter, but he's associated with the church, which I also thought was a really interesting addition to the story. It kind of created a dynamic I haven't really seen in fantasy romance before. It is YA, I don't know if I said that, but something about witches in a fantasy kind of gives me like spooky, eerie vibes. So I think this series, especially the first book, would be great to read around Halloween. Definitely an underrated series, and a witchy fantasy just hits when it's fall. Another whimsical, fun YA fantasy that I think you should read this fall is the Caraval trilogy by Stephanie Garber. If you like mystery and you like fantasy and you like games and riddles and a little bit of eeriness, this series would be perfect for you. It somehow manages to balance spooky with magical at the same time. It's kind of hard to explain the setup of these books, but essentially there is a game that gets held called Caraval, and you have to be invited to it. And actually, I don't really know how to explain it. It's been a while since I read those, but I just remember eating them up. It's basically just this big game that you're competing in, but there's tricks and there's riddles and nothing is as it seems. It's just such a fun read. The whole trilogy is great. If you like mystery and fantasy, a little bit of romance, a little bit of suspense, riddles, games, all of that, you would eat up this trilogy. And I did the worst job trying to explain what it's about, but just take my word for it that they're great. My next recommendation is the Six of Crows duology. This is an urban fantasy that follows a group of 6 unlikely people teaming up for a heist. These are in the Grishaverse, and they technically come after the Shadow and Bone trilogy. When people ask if they need to read the Shadow and Bone books before Six of Crows, I'm always torn, because part of me wants to say yes, just for the context you get about the world in Shadow and Bone, because then you're kind of already understanding the setup going into Six of Crows. But at the same time, Six of Crows is significantly better than Shadow and Bone. So it's like, you don't really need to waste your time reading Shadow and Bone to then go to Six of Crows. But I do think you would have a better experience reading Six of Crows if you read Shadow and Bone first. So take that as you will. I really don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it, but either way, you need to read Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. They're just phenomenal. It has the found family trope, and that is probably the best found family I have ever read. And Leigh Bardugo's writing is another one of those where you just get so sucked into the world, and like reading it, I could picture exactly how everything looked. My next fantasy recommendation is actually a standalone. It might be the only fantasy standalone that I'm recommending in this video, and it's called Ink Blood Sister Scribe. I got this book from Book of the Month, and if it weren't for Book of the Month, I would have never known this book existed. This is also a witchy fantasy, but it's set in modern day, and it's really hard to explain what this one's about also because there's so many different perspectives, but I thought it was fun because you're constantly jumping perspectives between all these people who are in different parts of the world, and then as the book progresses, their stories start to overlap and you start to find things out and discover how they're connected. And it was just a really intriguing book. Witchy fantasy is perfect for the fall time. That's the main reason I'm recommending this, but also I feel like people are always asking for fantasy standalone recommendations, and I haven't read many, but I did really enjoy this one. And also I just never hear people talking about it, so if you're wanting a witchy fantasy and you're not wanting to start a whole series, I think this would be a great one to pick up this fall. Next for fantasy and also a witchy fantasy, we have the Kingdom of the Wicked series. It's a trilogy, but there is a spin-off book, and I think more spin-off books to come. This is also classified as YA, but I think as the series goes, it definitely starts to get more new adult. But our main character is a witch, and she has a twin sister who's also a witch, and growing up their grandmother always told them not to get involved with the princes of hell. And then one day when they're older, something bad happens. I can't say what it is because that would be a spoiler, but our main character decides she's gonna try and figure out the mystery behind all of it. To do so, she needs the help of one of the princes of hell, who just so happens to be Wrath. I don't think I even said it, but there's 7 princes of hell who all reflect the 7 deadly sins. It's a very, very creative magic system, and I really love the setup of the world. But basically, she teams up with Prince Wrath, and it takes off from there. The first book is definitely more of a mystery, whereas I would say books 2 and 3 are more just like fantasy, romance, adventure. These are just fun, witchy fantasy romance. I mean, what more could you ask for? Next for fantasy, we have the Crowns of Nyaxia series, which is also known as The Serpent and the Wings of Night. These books are new adult fantasy romance, and they're following a human who lives in a vampire world and enters herself into a competition with the hope of gaining power at the end of it and finally being able to become strong like everyone else in the world she lives in. She ends up allying with a vampire who's from an enemy clan, and things kind of evolve from there. This was really fun. The trial elements of it were really, really entertaining and fun to read, but also the romance was fantastic. Great tension and banter, and the plot twist at the end of the first book is just incredible. If you've read some of the really popular fantasy romances like ACOTAR and Fourth Wing, and you're looking for something else that gives similar vibes, this is what I would recommend. And then also Carissa Broadbent has another series that does not get talked about enough, and that is the War of Lost Hearts trilogy. This is also a new adult fantasy romance, but a little bit lighter on the romance compared to the Crowns of Nyaxia. This follows our main character Tasana, who has grown up in slavery basically, wants to buy herself freedom and join a group of magic wielders called the Orders. And when she gets there, she becomes apprentice to a guy named Max, and they start training, and I cannot explain anything else because of spoilers, but I was just blown away by this trilogy. I was very surprised with how much I loved it. Everything about it is spectacular. The writing, the characters, the plot twists, the politics, the magic system, the world building. It's all phenomenal, and again, I can't really say much else about it without giving spoilers, but I highly, highly recommend this series. I just think it would be a great series to get into this fall. Next up, we have a YA fantasy romance, which is the Divine Rivals duology. We have Divine Rivals and we have Ruthless Vows, and something about these books scream fall to me, and I can't really put my finger on why that is. It could be because I read them in the fall time last year, but something about the way this world is described just feels like fall. This follows Iris and Roman, who are rivals at a newspaper, and Iris's brother is at war, and she writes him letters on her typewriter and then puts them under her wardrobe. She's been getting letters back, but little does she know it's not her brother responding, it's her rival from the paper. That's just kind of the general premise of it, but it is so much more than that. And I think my favorite thing about it is that it's kind of a historical fantasy, so even though this is a made-up world, it kind of feels reminiscent of like World War I. Very creative, never read anything like it. I ate up the romance in it, and the second book broke my heart, but in the best way possible. I could not recommend this duology enough. I know a lot of people love it, but it just seems like a fall read to me. And then lastly for fantasy, we have literally anything by Sarah J Maas. I know these are pretty basic recommendations, but I wouldn't be me if I didn't recommend ACOTAR, Throne of Glass, and Crescent City for you to read this fall. But honestly, these books are great no matter what time of year you read them. But I do have kind of a nostalgia associated with ACOTAR, specifically in the fall, because that's what I read when I first started getting back into reading, and it was like November of 2021, I think. So I just associate ACOTAR with the fall time, but also any of these would be great to read in the fall or any other time of year. That's all for fantasy. I know that was a lot of books, but guys, I promise that was my narrowed down list. Next, let's get into romance. I don't have quite as many romances because to me, I associate romance more with summer, but these are just a couple romances that I feel like would be great to read in the fall time and kind of give the cozy fall vibes. So to start off the romance recs, I have to recommend Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I considered recommending all of her books, but I feel like most of her books genuinely are just giving off summer vibes to me. However, Part of Your World is a small town romance. It's like big city girl meets small town guy, and the little town it takes place in always was reminding me of Stars Hollow from Gilmore Girls, which is like the ultimate fall TV show. So I feel like this one's very fitting for the fall time. I just love and adore the couple in this book. And one of my favorite things about all of Abby Jimenez's books is that they are romances, like little fun rom-coms, but they also talk about more serious things and the characters have a lot more depth to them, so they are also emotional reads. I love everything Abby Jimenez writes, but Part of Your World in particular I think would be perfect to cozy up with on a fall day. My next romance rec is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This one is romance but with a little bit of magical realism. This follows our main character who is grieving the death of her aunt. Her aunt has passed down her old apartment in New York City, and when she moves in, she starts to notice kind of weird things happening in the apartment, and turns out every time she goes in the apartment, she doesn't know if she'll be in the apartment in present day or the apartment 7 years in the past. That's when she meets the male love interest who she starts to bond with and build a connection with at the apartment, but in present day, she doesn't know where he is. I'm not really gonna say much else other than that because I don't want to spoil anything, but everything I just said is not giving anything away. I think that's all in the back of the book. There's several reasons why this is perfect for fall. One, it takes place in New York City, and just like picturing the New York City landscape is so fun while you're reading it, and I don't know why, but it just gives off fall vibes to me. Two, the writing is so beautiful and poetic, and Ashley Poston just has such a way with words where she can make the simplest things seem amazing and beautiful and just, I don't know how to explain it, but it's basically really, really, really good writing. And the romance is just so sweet and wholesome, and I love and adore everything about this book. And I don't know why, but just something about the mix of the New York City, the magical realism, the sweet romance, like it just seems fitting for the fall time. My next recommendation is a classic, Archer's Voice. I feel like a lot of people have already read this book, but if you haven't, this fall is when you should read it. This is also a small town romance, and I think I just have an association with small town romances and the fall time because of Gilmore Girls. And I'm not gonna try and explain what it's about because I feel like I do a really bad job of it. Actually, I'll grab it for you guys really quick. Okay, I just read the back and it makes this book seem really dramatic, but honestly, it is a pretty dramatic, angsty romance. It says, I wanted to lose myself in the small town of Pelion, Maine, to forget everything I had left behind. The sound of rain, the blood, the coldness of a gun against my skin. That's the part that sounds really dramatic. Like, don't let that scare you away from the book. For 6 months, each breath has been a reminder that I survived, and my dad didn't. I'm almost safe again, but the moment I meet Archer Hale, my entire world tilts on its axis, and it never rights itself again. Until I trespass into his strange, silent, and isolated world, Archer communicates with no one. Yet in his whiskey-colored eyes, something intangible happens between us. There's so much more to him than just his beauty, his presence, or the way his hands communicate with me. On me. Oh, I did not. This synopsis is not giving what the book is giving, but I'm gonna finish reading it. But this town is full of secrets and betrayals, and Archer is in the explosive center of it all. So much passion and so much hurt, but it's in Archer's silence that we might just find what we need to heal and to live. That very end part feels more reminiscent of what this book is actually like. It's a very emotional romance, that's for sure, but something about the synopsis is bugging me. So forget everything I just said. All in all, I'm just recommending this because it's a very emotional, heartfelt read and it's small town. So again, it just feels fitting for fall in my mind. My next recommendation is Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. Now, I'm gonna preface this by saying basically this entire book takes place in the summer, or at least one of the timelines does, but it still gives me fall vibes. This is a then and now timeline about our two main characters who become friends as children, and then something happens that kind of rips them apart from each other. They reunite in the present day timeline, and we're kind of jumping back and forth, seeing how they first met, and then now as they're trying to reconnect. It's a second chance romance, it's an emotional romance, and I just love this book so much. It was actually one of the first romances I read when I got back into reading, so it just holds a special place in my heart, and I don't know why, but I just feel in my gut that it's a fall read, even though a lot of it takes place in summer. My next recommendation for romance is gonna be the Boys of Tommen series. Finding and Keeping 13, Saving and Redeeming 6, and then Taming 7. I could go on about this series for probably the rest of my life, but I don't think you guys wanna hear me yap about it. All I will say is that it's really hard to explain what it's about. I am absolutely obsessed with it. I love it, I love the characters, I love the world, and also it is very emotionally heavy. There's a lot of really difficult topics that are touched on in these books, so look up trigger warnings, but if you take anything from my romance recommendations, it's to read those books this fall. I love them so much. And if you want to hear kind of more of my thoughts on them, definitely check out my August reading wrap up because I talk about 3 of those books in there. So if you're interested in knowing more of why I love the books and kind of what they're about, I talk about it a lot more in that video and I'll link it up here somewhere. A kind of similar series that I'm gonna recommend is the Magnolia Parks universe. When I first started this series, I hated the first book, but as I went on, I started to just fall in love with the characters and the world. The best way I can describe it is like Gossip Girl in London, but way more dramatic, way more heart-wrenching, and way more toxic. And if that sounds intriguing to you, honestly, I would say just go into it blind. That's kind of what I did. And if you're like me and you're not enjoying the first book, just keep pushing through the series because I promise by the end, you will be sobbing over how much you love those characters. And I can't really say much else about it because this is another one where if I try to explain it, I'm probably gonna give spoilers. So just read it. And then my last romance recommendation is the Ravenhood trilogy, Flock, Exodus, and why can't I remember the last book? It'll be up here, but I can't remember the name of it. These also partially take place during the summer, but something about the atmosphere and this world that these characters are in feels like fall to me. I went into these books completely blind and was way thrown off by how out of pocket some aspects of the romance were. So if you're gonna read these, just go into it knowing that it is kind of a dark romance. For a while, I kind of had a love-hate relationship with these books because the characters are so toxic and a little bit unlikable at points, but I was so entertained and so invested in the story. And there's a little bit of an eeriness to it and some action going on in some parts of it. And I don't know why, just the combination of all of that, small town romance, dark romance, little bit of mystery, little spooky, eerie, little crime. Something about that combo feels like fall and I don't really know why. Moving on to mysteries and thrillers, the first one right off the bat that you have to read this fall is the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy. I feel like a lot of people have already read this by now, but this is like the perfect YA mystery for the fall time. It's small town and also the way it's written makes you feel like you're solving the mystery alongside the characters. This book follows Pippa, who is trying to discover the truth behind an incident that happened in her small town years prior, and she's kind of digging back into the case even though it's been closed. And I'm not really gonna explain much else because I feel like it's fun to just go into it blind and experience it for yourself. But my favorite part about all those books is that Holly Jackson actually puts like the clues in the books. So if in the story Pippa finds a handwritten note, there will be like a picture of the handwritten note. or if she finds someone's phone and is reading a text message thread, it's shown as an actual text message thread instead of just explaining it. And something about that just makes the story way more immersive and so engaging. And there's also actually a Netflix show out of it now, so I think it'd be really fun to cozy up, binge this trilogy, and then watch the first season of the show right after. I also would recommend the Inheritance Games trilogy. This is another YA mystery, but it's not like your typical crime mystery. This is following our main character, Avery Grams, who has mysteriously left this very rich old man's inheritance after he passes, but the only stipulation with the inheritance is that she lives in the mansion with his family, and she doesn't know why she got left the money. She doesn't know how she's connected to them, and then she befriends the Hawthorne brothers, and they're kind of trying to figure this all out together. It kind of gives like academia vibes, but there's also a lot of riddles and games and puzzles that they're figuring out throughout the book. It has really short chapters. There's a little bit of romance going on. I mean, everything about it is phenomenal, and again, I just feel like that type of mystery in the fall would be so fun. Next, we're moving into some Freida McFadden books, which in my opinion, Freida McFadden is like the queen of thriller. She is to thriller what Colleen Hoover is to romance. I think her books are really easy to fly through. They've introduced a lot of people to the thriller genre. And so my first recommendations from her are gonna be The Housemaid and The Housemaid's Secret. There's also a third one out now called The Housemaid is Watching, and I have not read that one yet, but I absolutely ate up the first two books. I mean, talk about a bingeable thriller book. I think I finished both of those in one sitting. That's how engaging they are. I can't even begin to explain what they're about because I am scared to give plot twists, but just trust me with this. I don't think I know anyone that disliked those books. Another Freida book I want to recommend is called The Inmate. Once again, I cannot even begin to explain what it's about because I don't want to spoil anything, but look up the synopsis on Goodreads. This one was really fun, and the plot twists genuinely got me. Like, I was shocked. And again, just like all of Freida's books, extremely fast-paced, easy to binge, and shocking plot twists. Next up, I have two Lisa Jewell recommendations. None of this is true, and Then She Was Gone. I will preface these recommendations by saying, to me, Lisa Jewell isn't the type of thriller author that writes crazy plot twist thrillers. It's more just like engaging, eerie, more realistic thrillers, if that makes sense. So if you're wanting a thriller for the sole reason of having crazy plot twists, I wouldn't necessarily go with these, but they're super eerie, they're super spooky, and I was hooked the whole time I was reading both of these. None of This Is True is about two women who are birthday twins. One of them runs a podcast where she interviews women about their lives. They meet on a chance encounter, and the other woman convinces her to bring her on the podcast to talk about her life, and secrets about both of them start coming out from there. It's really hard to explain. This is one I would recommend doing on audiobook because where it's centered around a podcast, as you're listening to the audiobook, you actually feel like you're listening to a podcast. And I just think it makes for a more immersive experience. And then She Was Gone is basically just a kidnapping story. I also don't know how to explain this one without giving spoilers. But it's basically about a girl who goes missing, and then you're getting the perspective of a bunch of different characters who are in her life as the years pass and trying to figure out what happened to her. Both were phenomenal. I loved both of them. Super engaging and super entertaining. Another thriller I absolutely loved is Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I thought about not recommending this for fall because it takes place in the winter, and like the scenery of winter is very heavily a part of the story, but also the mystery thriller aspects of it are so good that I just had to include it on this list. I do feel like it's more of a wintry thriller, but it would also be great in the fall time. And this follows a couple who mysteriously wins a giveaway to a stay at this like old church in the middle of Scotland, I think. The husband has facial blindness, which means he can't like recognize people's faces, and you're basically going through them staying at this place as mysterious things start to happen, and then also flashbacks to when they first met and were getting married. And the plot twists in this are some of the best plot twists I've ever read. Like, I genuinely couldn't have figured out if I tried. Couldn't recommend this book enough. I absolutely loved it. I also have to recommend The Silent Patient. I feel like this is one of the most popular or one of the most talked about thrillers. This is by Alex I never know how to say his last name. I read his last name like Michaelides, but I've heard some people say Michaelides. So I'm not really sure how you actually pronounce it. I will say I did guess the plot twist, and I feel like it gets marketed as an impossible to guess plot twist. So it could have just been that I went into it with the intention of guessing the plot twist, and that's why I figured it out. But to me, the plot twist wasn't that hard to guess or figure out, but it still was spooky and eerie and just like fun to go through as the whole thing starts to unravel. I will say the writing style in this is very unique, but a little bit more complicated to understand than like a Lisa Jewell book or a Frida McFadden book, but it was still a really great read. And this takes place in an insane asylum, so definitely gives those spooky, eerie vibes that would be perfect around like Halloween. I'm also gonna recommend The Stranger Upstairs by Lisa M. Matlin. It follows a couple that moves into an abandoned murder house, and weird things start happening to them and weird things start happening in the town, and it kind of goes from there. It was very, very short and fast paced, which I love. Like, I never am dying to read a really long thriller. This one was straight and to the point, but it had plenty of suspense in there, and I just really loved it, and I think more people should read this. Lastly, for the other category, I only have 5 books, but I think all of these would be great fall reads. We have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This book was one of the first books I read when I got back into reading, and I absolutely loved it. The writing is beautiful, and I think the reason it gives me fall vibes is the historical aspects that are incorporated in it. I don't know why I have an association with like history and fall. And this is basically about a girl in like the 1400s. Her name's Addie, and she makes a deal with Death himself to live forever, but in exchange she is tricked and is never remembered by anyone else. You're following her as she goes through all these periods of history, and every day she meets people and interacts with them, but as soon as they walk away from her, they will never remember who she is, until one day in modern day New York, she runs into someone that does remember who she is, and the plot kind of goes from there. So poetic, so heart-wrenching, and just like the messages behind it were amazing, and V.E. Schwab's prose is beautiful. Next up, we had Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, this one, again, something about like things taking place in different time periods just makes me think of fall, and I don't know why that is. This is taking place in like the 60s and 70s, I believe, and it basically follows the rise and fall of the band Daisy Jones and the Six. My favorite thing about this book is the way it's written. It's written in interview form, so you're going through their whole story, but you're getting the recounts from all of the different band members. It was beautifully written. I was so entertained the whole time. I'm obsessed with all of the characters, and I also love the TV show of it. The way they brought the music to life was phenomenal. I would recommend this book in any season, but fall in particular, I feel like is just fitting for that book. Next up, we have The Art of Racing in the Rain. This is a really unique book because the entire thing is from a dog's perspective. Basically, all it is the story of a family, but you're seeing it through the dog's eyes. And if you're a pet owner or an animal lover in general, I think you would really appreciate this book because it kind of just gets your brain thinking about things and how pets see the world. And I don't know, it just makes you appreciate things differently. There's also a movie of this, and I recently rewatched it with my fiance, and we were both sobbing. It's just a very beautiful story, and I feel like I don't really see people talking about it on Book Talk, but I think the book says there's like over 3 million copies of it sold or something, so it must be popular. Next up, I'm gonna recommend the Red Rising series. This is a sci-fi series. It's like the only sci-fi I've read, but I loved it so much. It is very complicated, complex. The world building and politics are so masterfully developed. It's just phenomenal, and I feel like a lot of people have been talking about this series lately, and if you're interested in reading it, I would say just go for it because it took me so long to convince myself to start it, and I'm so glad that I finally did because I loved it. I ate up every single second of it, and I don't really know why this feels like fall to me, but I guess sci-fi is kind of similar to fantasy. Like, it just feels more fitting in the fall time. I feel like maybe I just wanted an excuse to recommend that series. My last recommendation for fall in the other category, I considered putting in thriller, and that's Bunny by Mona Awad. It is kind of a thriller, but it's also a horror, and it's a satire, and it's dark academia. really hard to explain. Reading this book is like being in a fever dream. You never really fully know what's happening. It's not a book I would consider to be one of my favorites, but it was just very thought-provoking, and I feel like there's a lot of ways that the way the story plays out can be interpreted. So if you like dark academia and you're looking for something thought-provoking but also entertaining and also want to be in a fever dream, Bunny by Mona Awad for sure. And those are all my fall book recommendations. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. And also let me know what you're hoping to get to this fall. If you're interested in following me on any of my other platforms, I do have my Instagram, TikTok, and Goodreads linked in the description below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and that's all for now. Bye guys!